to begin our program by summarizing the situation right now, which is that the world today faces deepening wars, rising militarization, and growing insecurity. From Gaza to Ukraine, Sudan, to other conflict zones, the world's people, especially women and children, continue to suffer the devastating human costs of war, displacement, poverty, rape, and violence. At the same time, we are witnessing the rise of authoritarianism, ultranationalism, and fascist movements in many parts of the world, fueling racism, repression, misogyny, xenophobia, and attacks on democratic rights and dissent. Global military spending is reaching record highs, whilst resources needed for healthcare, education, and climate action, as well as social protection, and increasingly, these funds are increasingly diverted towards weapons preparations. As the upcoming NATO summit approaches, many peace advocates and anti-war movements are questioning the role of military alliances and calling instead for diplomacy, demilitarization, and human-centered approaches to security. Donna, over to you.
I just wanted to share that, we want to make sure that we bring women together to address the root causes of war and inequality that's happening in the world. I think everyone is pretty well aware of the political crisis we are facing with the war in Iran. And so it's critical that women are at the forefront to address these issues. And women have been at the forefront. So we will hear from a few of them today. So we're very honored to have an esteemed panel of women representing the grassroots, as well as progressive women parliamentarians to share their thoughts and insights. Before we do that, I did want to share the main objectives for this webinar. The first is to support the call for peace and social justice by creating spaces for women from the grassroots and peace movements to voice their concerns over the increased wars of aggression happening in the world. We also want to foster productive dialogue and discussion between parliamentarians, women peace builders, anti-war activists, women advocates, feminist movements, and human rights defenders to develop a deeper understanding of the roots of conflict and war and the disproportionate impacts of war in causing gender-based violence, and to call to an end to military alliances like NATO. And 3, we want to develop regional strategies and plans that directly address the concerns of women and their communities who are most impacted by war and conflict. And we hope that by the end of this webinar, we can continue to work together, forge ahead in unity and in solidarity to put an end to these wars and all entities that are complicit in these wars. Before we move ahead in our program, I think it's also important we take time to thank all of our sponsors for this webinar. Without their support, this webinar would not have been possible. So I'd like to acknowledge those that are present here. You can see some of the organizations on your screen: the Pacific Peace Network, the International Peace Bureau, UNAC. We have WILP here, Fred's Wacht Peace Watch, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Mujeres de Negro in Madrid, World Beyond War, also based in Montreal, and World Beyond War Global, Naiset Rauhan Paulista, and so much more. So from the bottom of our hearts, we thank each and every one of you for your support. So now we'll begin the program, and I'll go ahead and pass it back to Pippa.
Thanks, Donna. Well, I think we also should thank the many activists who helped target some of our grassroots and parliamentary speakers who have help this along. We have so many wonderful people belonging to our two organisations, and they have made this possible. And I really ought to add also that we contacted many parliamentarians, and most of them didn't even answer us. Further ado, it is my honour to introduce our keynote speaker, Sevin Dagdelen. Sevin is a best-selling author, foreign policy expert, and served as a member of the German Federal Parliament from 2005 to 2025. A long-time member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and the Interparliamentary Conference on the European Common Foreign and Security Policy. Her expertise lies particularly in German and European foreign, security, and defence policy, as well as NATO and the EU. She served for many years on the advisory boards of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and the German Council on Foreign Relations. Dagdelen is known for her outspoken critique of military interventionism, her commitment to multilateral diplomacy, and her advocacy for a foreign policy based on international law. She has published extensively on transatlantic relations, global power shifts, and the future of European security. Her best-selling book on NATO has been published in German, Spanish, French, Chinese, Italian, Turkish, and English under the title NATO: A Reckoning. She is a frequent commentator in international media and speaker at global conference forums and symposia, including Washington, Brussels, Beijing, Moscow, Mexico, Istanbul, and Havana. She continues to contribute to foreign policy debates as an author and analyst. Sevin Dagdelen is a member of the foreign policy expert in the Federal Executive Board of the party. I am so delighted to introduce you, Sevin. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Is it okay with
Yes.
my voice? Thank you so much, Pippa. Thank you, Donna. Thanks for the invitation of the International Women Alliance and the Global Women for Peace United Against NATO. I'm very pleased to be here. And I just want to tell you, I'm normally Berlin-based. At the moment, I was on a journey. I'm doing my readings about my NATO book. And was in Cambridge the day before yesterday, also about NATO. And since I am on a journey, I have to excuse myself in advance that shortly after my contribution, I have to carry on my journey here. So you asked me to make a contribution on NATO and the many contradictions and crises within the NATO, and I'm happy to do so. So the NATO is under enormous stress at the moment because the United States is pushing hard for the Europeans to get much more involved financially and militarily. And the proxy war against Russia, especially in the proxy war against Russia, Germany has already become the biggest supporter of Ukraine financially. And Washington keeps demanding that we increase our aid even further. And through the new strategic partnership agreement with Ukraine, the German-Ukrainian partnership agreement, this development has been taken to the next level. It includes joint ventures between German and Ukrainian companies to develop and to produce long-range drones with a range of up to 1,500 kilometers. That means far beyond the border to Russia, also within the territory, deep in the territory of Russia. And in this way, Berlin is deliberately building a German-Ukrainian military-industrial complex under the German hegemony, in which German arms companies like Rheinmetall, which biggest shareholder is the US investment firm BlackRock, by the way, hold the majority of all these shares in this military-industrial complex, the German-Ukrainian. So step by step, Ukraine is becoming an extended workbench and a sales market for German arms production. Second, the contradiction within NATO are growing because the United States is also demanding that European NATO members get involved in the Middle East and West Asia, and to take part in the illegal war against Iran. This goes far beyond Europe's capacities, even with the current arms buildup. Germany is trying very hard to expand bilateral cooperation with Turkey, for example, but so far Turkey has not joined in. But I think it's a matter of time. In September, October, there will be German-Turkish governmental summit, and this is the plan to get Turkey into the boat then. Third, for decades, the standard argument in defense of NATO after the Warsaw Pact dissolved was very simple. Through this alliance, the United States protect its European allies. But recent events have completely shattered this comforting story. Washington's own partners in the Middle East now openly accuse the United States of abandoning them. They receive no warning before the illegal US-Israeli attack on Iran, for example. And the US was neither willing nor able to concentrate its forces on protecting the Gulf states. So in this regard, for example, the 5,000 American soldiers now are being withdrawn from Germany. And President Trump has clearly stated if Europe does not help in the Strait of Hormuz to secure American hegemony, is being abandoned by the Strait of Hormuz, America will no longer help Europe, he said, the US president. And the alliance, the military pact, NATO, that was supposed to secure American hegemony is being now abandoned by the United States itself. And this strikes at the very heart of the North Atlantic Treaty. When the leading power questions its commitment to collective defense, the entire alliance is called into question. So in Europe too, more and more people have the impression that the United States is no longer a reliable partner. Germany is trying to fill this gap by claiming a position of hegemony in Europe. And fourth, the withdrawal of US troops from Germany and their relocation to Poland, what was now canceled by the Secretary of War in the United States, Pete Hegseth, while at the same time massively increasing troop numbers in the Indo-Pacific. So what is a good news for Germany, withdrawing 5,000 American soldiers, can be a very bad one for China, Indo-Pacific, and West Asia. Because this raises the question whether the United States still sees itself as a protector of Europe, or whether the United States bases mainly serve the American global power projection, like the General Secretary of the NATO himself stated in end of March, that NATO is the platform for power projection globally for the United States. So this withdrawal by the US, the 5,000 American soldiers, and the discussions about ongoing withdrawals, we have to say that it's not just a spontaneous decision by Trump, like the German or the European media is trying to frame it, like because of the vibe between Trump and German Chancellor Merz. I think it is a part of a long-term strategy known as the pivot to Asia. The United States is shifting its military focus towards China. The number of US troops and their families in the second island chain is to increase by 300% to 33,000, with another 10,000 planned for the 10 next years. Guam is being turned into a major fortress with new missile systems and modernized airfields, $1 billion investment in 2026 alone, so in this ongoing year. And old bases on Tinian, Saipan, Rota, the Philippines, and Palau are being reactivated and massively expanded at the moment. With this arms build-up, NATO is destroying exactly, for example, in Europe, exactly the society it claims to defend. So the worst impact, this is the worst impact on the European welfare, is on the European welfare state. The United States demands that NATO members spend 5% of their GDP on defense. For Germany alone, that would mean about 220 billion euro per year. 220 billion per year. This is almost the half of the entire federal budget of Germany. So the federal budget is 500 billion, and 220 billion would be, almost a half. And we have to be very careful here because there is so much propaganda going on regarding this rearmament that we would have similarly military spending during the Cold War. And this is false because back then we had a strong economic growth in Europe, in Germany, and today we have stagnation since 4 years. We have recession. Every extra euro, every extra pound in UK for arms has to be brutally cut from healthcare, education, or pensions. And healthcare, pensions, social security, these are achievements won through 150 years of worker struggles. And they are being sacrificed now on the altar of endless rearmament. And NATO claims to protect Europe, but it threatens to destroy the very society it pretends to defend. So, and it is like a bull in a china shop that the achievements of 150 years of worker struggles are now at risk. And this also increases the crisis and the contradiction inside the NATO. So more and more people are questioning this. Is it sensible? Isn't it reckless to force such a armament, and on the other way to have the social cuts? Sixth, the German government wants to make the Bundeswehr, the German army, to the largest army in Europe. I mean, we had this once, and we know how the history ended, and is tending towards acquiring nuclear options, because otherwise this all conventional arms buildup makes little sense against the largest nuclear power, Russia. And the question is whether the war preparations up to 2039, this is the goal, being the strongest conventional army of Europe in the year 2039, you have to consider here the magic of the figures, 2039, and we had 1939. And but these are this question now is whether the war preparation up to 2039 are directed only against Russia in the long term, or whether Germany is using this rearmament to claim the position of the strongest power in Europe, together with the creation of a German-Ukrainian military complex. And next point is Germany's war preparations, for which the United States has given the green light. So it's not against the will of the United States what's going on in Germany regarding militarization. But this militarization, these war preparations are bringing back the ghost of the past. In Germany, there is a growing focus on creating anti-Russian buffer states similar to those of Brest-Litovsk, which would be controlled by Germany and used as a springboard against Russia. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 created a series of buffer states under German leadership, with Ukraine being the largest and most economically important one. And Berlin seems to be reviving these old geopolitical ideas today. as the United States withdraws, Ukraine is becoming more and more a military, economic, and political outpost of Germany. And this puts enormous strain on NATO in Europe because these are bilateral German-Ukrainian agreements outside the alliance, outside the military pact NATO. And continuing NATO membership is now unleashing German militarism. The peace movement, so I come to the end, the peace movement, German, Europe, and internationally must not stop at simply saying no to rearmament and conscription. It must demand an end to the vassal status of the countries towards the United States. And that means ending vassalage to the United States means leaving NATO, going out of NATO. And this would also help raise public awareness and must be combined with a campaign against the social war, because there is not just the rearmament, the militarization, war preparations, it's also a social war against their own populations and being waged against their own populations. And whoever speaks about social cuts must not stay silent about rearmament and war preparations. What is going on, for example, within the trade unions at the moment and some so-called left parties in Europe. They are now protesting and struggling against social cuts, defending social welfare states, but they don't say any word regarding the rearmament and the war preparations. But these are two sides of one coin, of the same coin. If you don't speak about rearmament, you don't have to say anything about social cuts anymore. And because there's no credibility at all. This is the reason why they are going to do the social cuts. And last point, since its founding in 1949, because I'm always facing sometimes in the last months or years, especially since Trump got into charge in office, there are predictions of NATO's imminent end. Yeah, and we have to look back really since 1949. There are predictions of NATO's imminent end. They have accompanied the alliance since their beginning. But these death announcements by leading politicians only serve to expand military structures and increase the expansion of the NATO, because the facts tell a different story. NATO states are now spending 1.6 trillion US dollars, more than ever before. Secretary of War of the United States just announced yesterday that they are going to have military expenditures on the level of 1.5 trillion, just their own now. That means it will rise up to maybe 1.8, 1.9 in the next year. In general, common costs stand at 5.3 billion euros, at a record high, the common one, for the headquarter and for the bases here. So NATO accounts for 55% of global military spending, and this share is set to rise further with a decision to increase spending to 5% of the GDP. That's why I am pledging that we must focus on this NATO's ideological mobilization, which is intensifying the social contradictions. More and more people are being labeled as Kremlin friends or now China friends, just as Israel shields itself from criticism. That's the thing what they're doing now. And NATO is increasingly undermining the formal freedoms. We have now the European Union. The European Union now is sanctioning journalists just for their reports critical on the Gaza war, pro-Palestine protests they were carrying. That's why a Berlin-based German citizen, Hüseyin Doğru, with a Turkish background, is now sanctioned. That means they stopped, he can't travel He can't work. He's not allowed to travel. He's not allowed to work. They stopped his bank account. They canceled his bank account. They freezed his assets. And this is just, destroying his existence. And there are a lot of other sanctioned people. And this is because they are preparing for this war. And this is why they're undermining these formal freedoms, and they'll be endangering its own fiction as a community of values. And last sentence, therefore, to summarize, I think we should focus on these contradictions. Because of this rearmament, the contradictions are rising regarding the social cuts. And this vassalage to the United States is destroying their own societies. And to end it, we have to leave the NATO to have a more sovereign, more self-determination, more autonomy on the politics we are doing here. And this awareness is coming up and is rising at the moment, as far as I can see, especially in Germany, for example. We had an opinion poll that the majority of the German people are rejecting Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Rejecting Article 5 of the NATO Treaty means rejecting the heart of the NATO Treaty, yeah? Because they don't believe the Baltic states, they don't believe Turkey, they are frightened that these countries could tide us and drag us into a war. And that's why also why the NATO now stroke back against the Ukrainian drones over the Baltics and Baltic states, because they do not want to be dragged into this war, the Germans. So, and I think this is our duty of today, and maybe in cooperation with the Global South, with the BRIC states, because I do believe that. I do think that it's justified to say that there is the hope. Thank you very much.
I just really enjoyed that so much, and we'd love to have you back again. What
you.
you're saying is we have to help people join the dots between the horrors of war and militarization and the associated spend with our own diminishing lack of social safety nets and
Absolutely.
hospitals and schools, education and healthcare. Everything that is important to maintain a cohesive society is being sacrificed for militarization. I've really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much indeed. Now I think we must pass on straight to our next speaker. So I'll pass to Donna now. Thank you. Thank you again, Sevin.
Thank you so much, Sevin. So we'll go ahead now and start with our panel of speakers representing women from the grassroots. And so I'd like to go ahead and introduce our first speaker. It's going to be a video submission. This speaker is Wendella de Vries with Stop Wapenhandel. She is a longtime researcher and campaigner against arms trade and military industry at the independent peace organization Stop Wapenhandel Netherlands, of which she is the co-founder. She's part of the steering group of the European Network Against Arms Trade and coordinates an international working group on arms, militarism, and climate justice. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and play her video.
Hello, I'm Wendella de Vries from Stop Wapenhandel. We are a research and campaign group based in the Netherlands on arms trade and arms production and militarization in general. I'm also since a few years very much working on the relation between militarism, arms and climate crisis. I'm also coordinating an international working group of researchers and campaigners on this topic. It's an informal working group, and we try to share our research, our campaigns, to stimulate each other and support each other, because it's a huge topic and it's complicated, and working together is always makes us always stronger. So, well, there's of course a huge relation between the military and fossil fuels. Since 1973, a third to half of all the wars have a direct connection with fossil fuels, are fought about fossil fuels, notably oil. And the military itself is also very polluting. Military depends completely on fossil fuels. All these warships and warplanes and rolling material, they are enormous consumers of fossil fuels, and there's no alternative. The military sometimes is suggesting that they're going green, that are changing their fuel consumption, that there will be more sustainable warfare, whatever that may be. And they try to add, for example, biofuels to the fuel tanks, and sustainable biofuels, synthetic biofuels. But these alternative fuels are not available in such a huge amount. There's also a lot of competition with other sectors about these fuels. So it is not possible to have a green war, whatever they are telling us. Rising military spending is contributing to an increase of fossil fuel consumption, which is logical. It's calculated that when all NATO countries will raise their military spending to 3.5% of their GDP by 2030, this will add an annual amount of greenhouse gas emissions comparable with the annual amount of greenhouse gas emissions of Brazil and Japan together. So there's a direct connection between the increase of military spending and the increase of military pollution. Of course, there's also a lot of military pollution through wars. We all see the war in Ukraine. We see both sides bombing each other's refineries, bombing each other's facilities for fossil fuels. We see it, of course, in the war in Iran, but also the war in Gaza. It is calculated that in the first months of the war in Gaza, how much fossil fuels that have been produced by all the bombing and explosives. And half of the fossil fuels that were used in that period and half of the emissions from the period come from the transport of arms from the United States to Israel. So, but by this very big military transport planes, they are very, very polluting. So you see that wars are really an increasing risk, of course, not only for peace and justice and everything, but also for the climate. Well, how is the military responding to this? Well, the NATO says they have a climate policy, they have climate bureaus, they have climate reports, but these reports focus mostly on how the military should adapt to the climate crisis. They're not doing anything to stop it. They're adapting their strategies and their equipment to make them resilient to extreme weather conditions. For example, some planes have problems with extreme heat. The melting of the ice cap in the north, of course, leads to the conflict around Greenland, where now it is possible to go for deep sea minerals, and now it is an interesting place for NATO to go to. So they made a new command, the Arctic Command, to dominate the area that was first not interesting at all. You also see that there's that adaptation of bases, like naval bases that have problems with increased extremity of storms, tornadoes. They have no obligation to reduce their fossil fuel use or to reduce their emissions. They have no obligation also to report to the UNFCCC Climate Committee. The Pentagon has lobbied for an extension of the military already at the Kyoto Protocol processes. So we don't know exactly how much they pollute. The estimates are that the military contribute at least 5.5% of all the greenhouse gases in the world. And this calculation is, of course, a complete estimate because we have no figures, but it was made before the war in Ukraine, before the war in Gaza. So it might be even more. It's most likely an underestimation. Of course, we are not accepting this. So we are organizing a week of action in September, from 21st to 27th of September. We have done this 2 times before already. This is the 3rd week of action for peace and climate justice. In previous editions, we had more than 100 groups all over the world having actions, demonstrations, webinars, research published to raise attention for the contribution of the military to the climate crisis. So please go to the website climatemilitarism.org and join the actions in September.
And that was our video presentation by Wendella de Vries, who raises a very important issue when it comes to war and militarism, and that is the issue of the destruction of our environment, the pollution that militaries have when waging war, the destruction of land, and the impacts that it has on communities. And one thing that she didn't say in name, but she mentioned in her presentation, which is a term that has been used in various international platforms, the term of ecocide. Ecocide essentially is the destruction of the natural environment because of the act of war. And we saw this demonstrated in a recent tribunal on Palestine, where there is a global campaign push to recognize under international humanitarian law the crime of ecocide that has genocidal impacts on the people because of pollutants, because of bombing, and because of these acts of war as crimes against humanity. And so I think it's really important that we raise these issues. And so we thank Wendella for raising that and, interrelating the issue of war and militarism to climate justice and the fight to save Mother Earth and, in a sense, to save all of humanity. So thank you, Wendella, for that presentation. I'll go ahead and pass it back to Pippa.
Thank you, Donna. Well, our second speaker today is Christine Akinyi of the Revolutionary Women's League. Christine is a cadre of the Communist Party Marxist Kenya and serves as the vice chair of the Revolutionary Women's League, a mass organization within the party. She's also a writer, feminist, artist, and freelance journalist whose work moves across fiction, essay, and journalism to explore the body as a political, emotional, and social site. Across her artistry, she remains attuned to the body, its vulnerabilities, rebellions, intimacies, and possibilities. Her writing is concerned with autonomy, desire, survival, and extraction, often returning to how women's lives are shaped through love, intimacy, and power. She's currently researching how women's bodies are implicated in systems of economic extraction and sexual and violent harm. Her work has appeared in the Star newspaper, the Ibua Journal, the Nairobi Stripes literary magazine, the African Griot, and Growing into Our Bodies on Bodies, Rights, and Abortion. Christine, thank you so much for joining us. I'll hand the floor over to you now.
Thank you so much, Peppa. I'll be making an audio presentation to talk about organizing in the grassroots as we oppose NATO in Kenya. So, as has been said already in the introduction from my bio, I'm a cadre of the Communist Party Marxist of Kenya, and I'm the vice chair of the Revolutionary Women's League, which is a mass organization within the party. And today I'll be talking a bit and sharing my reflections on the fascist regime that we're living in currently as Kenyans, and how different movements and progressives are fighting against that fascism, the very imperialism, and resisting against it. So first and foremost, so I'll begin. To comprehend fascism on a scientific lens means that we move beyond liberal explanations that would actually maybe just reduce it to mere dictatorship and authoritarianism, and even observing the personality of reactionary leaders within the African continent, and particularly in Kenya. So, under the current regime of our president, fascism has reared its head, and it's become apparent through the violent economy that a lot of Kenyans are now being subject to and living under, having to survive. And under capitalism also, Kenya is capitalist and feudal, but majorly capitalism. We are encountering a lot of global crises, because in Kenya, the people who bear the brunt of this crisis are mostly the working class, the working people, the peasants, and the proletariat. And these are the people who encumber and bear the brunt of this violent economy. And under capitalism, these crises are felt differently in different magnitudes in according to different classes. Currently, Kenya has a fuel shortage, and this has led to increased prices of fuel. Politicians are still being ferried and moving around in their convoys, while the elites are also still continuing to import luxury goods, but the people are languishing. The workers are languishing. They're walking to work. They're making cuts to skip meals so that they survive, and also they're sinking deeper into debt. And beyond the increasing fuel prices, there's now the rippling effect that comes to impact the economy and the entire ecosystem through commodity prices, farming, because fuel prices affect a lot of sectors. It affects commodity pricing, it affects food distribution within the country, it affects farming also, and the formal labor and mobility generally. So consequently, inflation spreads as a result of this, and survival becomes so much stringent, and it's felt so much more as costs rise. And the state now understands that in the thick of this, the population in return becomes angry because of taxation, and there's also high rates of unemployment as well as debts. And this also makes it possible for living conditions to collapse and get to languish even further. And instead of restructuring this, the state responds by criminalizing protest, curtailing dissent, and surveilling citizens. And it is in this way that the state now contains the masses and the people on behalf of capital to solve to instead, by instead dealing with the consequences of this anger of the people, uh, instead of solving the source of that anger in the first place. And Kenya's dependency also worsens a number of these crises, especially since Kenya has no control over austerity measures by the IMF, for example, over the vulnerability of our currency, and even global oil prices, which we are presently suffering the consequences of. And that makes it so that these crises are felt and they land even harder on the working people, on the masses. And as all this ensues, the local ruling class, they protect themselves, they protect foreign investors and elite, and also prioritize elite accumulation. This now renders the masses to bear the brunt of this global crisis, while the states and the elite are protected, and the very structure and architecture producing them in the first place. So also for non-NATO allyship status that Kenya was accorded in 2024, rather designated in 2024. Kenya became a NATO. Kenya is not formally a NATO member, but it got allyship in 2024 by President Joe Biden. And this status formalizes Kenya as a key security partner of the US. And this means that now there's intelligence shared across the two countries. There's also increased militarization and cooperation. This specifically we can look at and contextualize with by the presence of the British Army in Laikipia in Kenya. And this also means that the two countries come together to counter, to work, to merge and strategize around counterterrorism. And also they provide security frameworks developed for external threats. That means that the two countries here now, Kenya and the USA, come to a merger to curb and counter terrorism. And this means that ideally the security frameworks that are developed for external threats can now even spill inward to dissent the masses and curtail their voices. So this allyship also necessitates a certain prerequisites of stability and geopolitical discipline. And this is because US has interest in the Horn of Africa, the Red Sea, and even the Indian Ocean as well, and generally the region for stability so that they can trade. So looking at this also on the political economic dimension, this partnership now goes hand in hand with economic governance, and it makes it necessary for order to be maintained so that donor confidence is also maintained, debt negotiations and macroeconomic policies credibility. So in a nutshell, Kenya's major non-NATO allyship status, it situates the country more firmly within a global security order led by the USA. And as somebody who's who's part of the leadership in a women's organization, women mass organization organizing at the grassroots, some of the ways on which we are fighting back, we are having advocacy at the grassroots to talk about the consequences of this imperialism, the consequences of NATO allyship. We are comparing situations, what has happened in the Congo, particularly what is happening in the Congo, where now women's bodies become a source of labor. And this also happens while they're sexually violated. So we're looking also at the political economy that makes women vulnerable to systems that harm them. And this also happens when women are facing oppression from both fronts, from the patriarchy and also in the economic systems that they're living under. For most countries, or in the Congo and even in Kenya, evidently women are oppressed under patriarchy and also under capitalism. So we are just comparing and seeing how these struggles are interconnected and the very structures and systems that make this possible. So women in the grassroots, myself, other members of the Revolutionary Women's League, progressive movements, socialist movements, what we are doing, how we are fighting back, how we are resisting. We are protesting for one. We are having care programs within the grassroots, because as people resist, as people fight against imperialism, as people fight against fascism, there's need for care, because for sustenance, for durability, the care needs to be there. Women are taking care of children, they're still sustaining their households. That is happening. And there's also now documentation of disappearances, documentation of harassment. That is also being done as a way of resistance. And there's also educating, disseminating information, having discussions, having forums. Recently, Kenya hosted the Pan-African Summit Against Imperialism in Nairobi, Kenya, to oppose the other summit that was led by French President Macron, where Kenya came into an agreement with France. And that is imperialism, French imperialism rearing its head slowly by slowly. We are going to, under that agreement, Kenya is allowed to bring troops here. And when we look also at the at the conflict economies, what is already happening, what had happened in the Sahel, why the French were dispersed from the Sahel, and they're now trying to come back to East Africa and set base in Kenya. That could easily be us. That could easily be any other African country. So in some of the ways we are also resisting against this is seeing ourselves, um, contextualizing our struggle to see how disposable we are as a country and what that means for women. And also now as austerity measures are being enacted, now as the grassroots woman is suffering no food, unemployment. Some of the ways that women in the grassroots are also resisting is also just by fostering and strengthening their small care economies within their communities, and also documenting abuse, which I'd already talked about, and also supporting victims of state violence socially and economically. So in another way that this resistance is also taking place, I'd mentioned care work, I'd mentioned supporting victims of state violence legally and socially. Yes, and yeah, so generally the resistance now trickles also to foster survivor networks because, as I've said, also the, women are predisposed to violent sexual harm when under imperialism and even under fascism. So also fostering survivor networks and legal aid mobilization, and also just being aware and cognizant of how this happens, because there's data and statistic of that already happening as a result of the Batuk base, which is in Kenya and the largest British base uh, currently in Laikipia. So also just being cognizant and being aware of the repercussions and the consequences it has, especially on women, of our vulnerabilities, besides the economic consequences it has on the economy, and what that means now for the worker, for the peasant, and for the proletariat. So I've come to the end of my reflections. That is how women in Kenya, women in the grassroots, are resisting fascism and imperialism, and also how fascism can be contextualized within the Kenyan economy and how it manifests, and also what the non-NATO allyship member, what the non-allyship member designation for Kenya has meant since Kenya got this designation in the year 2024. That is all. Thank you, Peppa. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Christine. That was wonderful. And I am so glad you mentioned capitalism because, of course, all our problems, whether social, whether environmental, whether gender-based, they all stem from this vulture capitalism, which is galloping away with all our rights and most of our money. And of course, capitalism protects the elites, as you so carefully said. I'm so glad to have heard what you said, and it's good to have your reflections from a Kenyan point of view. So thank you again. And I think the next thing we are going to do is move to our third speaker, and Donna is going to introduce her.
Yes, thank you, Pippa, and also thank you, Christine, for your reflections. Our last and final speaker for our grassroots panel is Emma. Emma is a member of the Resist US-led War Seattle chapter and is also a part of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. Resist Seattle is an anti-war organization in solidarity with the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines, and is an organization based at the University of Washington. Please welcome Emma.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. It's really an honor to present alongside so many anti-imperialist women serving the people, fighting for genuine solutions to gender oppression around the world. So military alliances like NATO are created as a weapon of US imperialism, wielded against any country that threatens US economic hegemony. NATO does not keep the people of the world safe. It advances and expands US war by provoking Russia, by supporting Israel, and now building up to war against China. Its weapons pointed at the working class and exploited women around the world who bear the brunt of war and displacement. The US is strengthening its military partnerships and coordination with Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand, and most of all, the Philippines, which is right next to China and has been under the control of US imperialism since the end of World War II, when General MacArthur referred to the Philippines as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. This year, more than 500 military games will be held in the Philippines. Last month, the US led the largest military exercise ever in the Philippines. 17,000 foreign troops flooded the islands, and during which they launched a Tomahawk missile aimed at China. The night before these war games started, the US-backed armed forces of the Philippines massacred 19 people in the island of Negros, including 2 Filipino Americans, Kai Sorum and Lyle Frijoles, who had gone home to serve their people in the countryside. These military exercises don't protect the Philippines from China. They terrorize the Filipino people, displace them from their land and fishing grounds, sex traffic women and girls into military bases, and perpetuate cycles of forced migration that leads them to be exploited and criminalized overseas. Under an economy dependent on war, as capitalism is, universities like the University of Washington are funded by weapons and technology corporations like Boeing that use student labor and resources to develop technology for war. Boeing Scan Eagle drones and bombs that have been sold to the Philippine military to perpetuate attacks like this one, we are still grieving on the Negros 19. And Laura McGill, engineering vice president of Raytheon Missiles and chief engineer of the Tomahawk missile, is recognized by the University of Washington as a distinguished alumni and a woman trailblazer in the war industry. This is not what gender liberation looks like. Genuine liberation looks like honoring Kai Sorum, who went home to serve her people, facing the most oppressive conditions in the countryside. We honor her by building grassroots organizations to understand the issues of working women locally and wage campaigns in international solidarity for the Philippines. We honor her by calling on our government to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act, which would cut military aid to the armed forces of the Philippines, by pressuring the University of Washington to cut all ties with Boeing, and providing people's education that can grow the anti-war Philippine solidarity movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma, for those reflections and for connecting what's happening in the Philippines to the overall issue of US warmongering, everything from weapons manufacturing to war exercises and its influence within NATO and how that is having an impact on the people of the world. And specifically in countries like the Philippines. I personally also knew Kai Sorum, who is from Seattle, where I'm based, and we're all very devastated by the unfortunate event, but is also very much a reality of US imperialism's influence on the Philippines and the rising fascist attacks on activists, human rights defenders, and the people of the world. And many activists and women on the front lines have been subjected to these acts of violence. So we stand with you in your call for the justice of those who have been martyred, the Negros 19.
Well, we've been, as I said earlier, having trouble getting enough parliamentarians to speak out to make a full program. This is very irritating. We targeted all the most likely ones from almost everywhere in the world. I myself contacted 12. Only one even responded to say they couldn't do it. Most of our parliamentarians are either bought or they're paid for by other entities, which I won't mention here. Finally, of course, a lot of them, certainly in Britain and across Europe, are Russophobes. And this ongoing Ukraine proxy war against Russia, which is, of course, a NATO war, a US war, is being devised now to take up most of the money or most of the GDP that our countries are actually able to make. This is the kind of problem which we can't overcome without getting together. We can't overcome without joining the dots between social injustice, economic injustice, and the justice of freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and all the freedoms which we see being taken away from us on our streets across Europe, America, and most of the world. We have to join these dots, we have to mobilize, and we can do this by targeting NATO of one of the chief criminals in the world in terms of war and absorption of money that really is becoming criminal in itself. Well, I'm glad to say we have our first parliamentarian coming to us now to speak. And this is Özlem Demirel from the EU Parliament. I have to introduce her as a Turkish-born German politician of Kurdish descent. She's a member of the European Parliament and an active member of the left group within the EU Parliament. She serves as a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, the Committee on Security and Defence, the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, and the Committee on Employment and Social Affairs. I believe Özlem is coming to us by video because the time wasn't right for her. So let's listen hard to what she has to say. Thank you.
Dear friends, thank you very much for the invitation to this important event. Sadly, I cannot join you in this webinar today, but I'm happy to use the opportunity to talk to you. So let me share some insights from my work as a member of the European Parliament for the German Die Linke. The upcoming NATO summit in Ankara comes at a crucial point in time. The world is marked by struggles and conflicts. It's a time of monsters. They want to redistribute and reorder the world. Trump is putting pressure on the Europeans to pay for their share in the world domination. NATO itself is marked by an internal conflict. He does not want to hand them a share for the free anymore. Some are already talking about the end of the NATO. This could be a moment of joy for all peace-oriented people if there were only true. Because the military alliance has never been a force for peace. It was always used to organize Western military power and to project force in imperialist wars together by the US and EU. But let me make 2 points clear. First, I don't believe that the NATO comes to an end. It's not yet being abolished. The US still needs the military bases in Europe for global wars like we saw in Iran. And the Europeans desperately want to keep the US in because they need more time for their own military build-up. And here I come to my second point. NATO's 5% target is the key figure for European governments. And the EU is following with its own multi-billion euros armed programs. For the peace movement, it's not just about NATO, but about an anti-militarist politics. And the EU is going far away from politics of diplomacy and so-called soft power. Instead, they built up a military EU to be able to enforce their own interest in this world order. It's like Ramsey said, the old is dying and the new is not yet able to be born. So it's time of monsters, because the new should not mean to replace an old disgusting order or military union with another. The new should be a real system of peace, justice and equality. Instead, we all are witnessing the opposite. Hard struggles for the interests of capitalists, increasing conflicts and militarization. This means not just that the bill is being paid by ordinary working people and most notably by women. Cuts to social services, lacking public investment and lower public service wages affect all peoples and our future. But it also means that those same people, the working class women and men, will have to pay with their lives on the battlefields of upcoming wars. Wars which are not theirs and in their interest. In the end, NATO and the European arms built up will not lead to real security, but to an even more militarized, unjust and poor society. And that's why organizing, resisting and build up a strong peace movement all over the world could be our only option in the project of life. We all here choose life, not destruction, and for that I will thank you. This is the hope for our future.
Well, thank you so much to Ozalem Demirel. That was lovely. And underlines what we've been saying. This is a time of monsters. And this new world that we also desperately seek cannot be born yet because we're not asking for it loudly enough. We need to organize and resist, as Ozalem has said, because there is no other way. So thank you so much for that. And now I will pass over to Donna, who will introduce our next parliamentary speaker.
Thank you, Pippa. And I completely agree with you. I really agree with Aslam's points in terms of her intervention there. And that the solution really is to build up a peace movement to oppose capitalism and all of its warmongering interests. For our second parliamentarian, also a video submission, we have Alice Mary Higgins, who's a senator based in Ireland. Alice Mary Higgins has over 2 decades of experience in policy advocacy and legislation across the areas of equality, environment, human rights, and social inclusion. In 2016, Alice Mary was elected to the Shanad Iran, the first woman in 35 years elected to the NUI panel. She was re-elected in 2020, an advocate for social and economic equality all of her adult life. Alice Mary brings passion, thought, and care to her work as a senator. She's an active and effective legislator who has won over 70 changes to law and sponsored 20 bills, including the Mandate for Nature Bill, Adequate Minimum Wage Bill, Arms Embargo Bill, and Occupied Territories Bill. Alice Mary leads the Shanad Civil Engagement Group, working with independent senators Francis Black, Rin Ruane, and Eileen Flynn to strengthen links between civil society and politics. She believes every citizen should have a vote in the Shanad elections. In 2020, Miriam Lord of the Irish Times chose Alice Mary as Senator of the Year for her tireless approach, collegial outlook, level of research, grasp of detail, participation in debates, and undimmed enthusiasm for the job.
I'm Senator Alice Mary Higgins, and I'm sending a message of solidarity to all those women working for peace. The work of peace is something that we understand in Ireland from our own peace process, and the crucial role that women and the Women's Coalition played in shaping that process and ensuring that human rights were at its core. Ireland is also, and the people of Ireland are also very proud of our neutrality. It's a neutrality that has earned us respect internationally and allowed us to be credible voices on international law, where many women, including Bláthnaid Ní Chofaigh and others, have been championing international law right now at a time when it is under more attack than ever. And Ireland's neutrality has also allowed us to play a role in disarmament. We were the first country to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it was Ireland that hosted, and I was there to see Ireland host the global ban on cluster bombs. Yet, right now, that neutrality is under attack. We have a government that want to move away from the United Nations system and that essential core principle in the preamble of the duty of all nations to protect future generations from the scourge of war, the promises that we make to each other through the United Nations system, and instead shift towards a narrative of international security that is too often driven by a politics of big powers rather than a politics of principle. And we are also seeing a slide away from disarmament at a time when we should be strengthening our disarmament efforts, where we should be negotiating new treaties, for example, to ban autonomous weapons. We are instead seeing countries leaving the Cluster Munitions Treaty and leaving the Landmines Treaty. And we're seeing money at European level which should be going to European citizens, to social cohesion, to social security systems, and to fighting climate change, which is the real security threat we all face, being rerouted into hundreds of millions on weaponry. Weaponry which will in itself contribute to that climate crisis and will make us all less safe. And that's a narrative being pushed by those such as Mark Rutte from NATO and many others that we need to push back against, because we need to talk about what peace really needs is not just a narrative of security, but a narrative of serious, deep work for peace and a reaffirmation of international law, a recommitment to disarmament and the protection of neutrality here in Ireland. That's something we'll be pushing for, and we will also be joining with all of you in that wider work of peace. So I wish everyone well for this conference.
That was Mary Alice Higgins, a very strong proponent of peace in Ireland. And I think a comment she made regarding international security really hits at the core of what has been driving wars of aggression around the world, what has been driving NATO to continue its more warmongering schemes. And it's really the underlying issue of being driven by politics of big power, being driven by capitalist greed, versus the principle of protecting the people, of protecting our social and political rights, our democratic rights, and ensuring the peace and security of all people around the world. So while most parliamentarians may not necessarily stand on this principle, we are very lucky to have the few who are willing to stand up against the majority and stand with the people on principle and on human rights. So thank you again to our parliamentarians, Özlem and Mary Alice. I'll go ahead and pass it on to Pippa to open up the floor for Q&A.
Yes, well, that concludes our program of speakers. And I must say, we really do have some really wonderful speakers with some very, very good points that we should all take home and work with. Now we would like to open the floor to ask any questions of our speakers who are present with us today, which would be Seven, Christine, and Emma. So please share your questions in the chat.
I have a question here that we can direct to both Emma and Christine. A question is, how can grassroots women and parliamentarians work together to address the roots of conflict, war, and crisis? So whoever wants to take on that question first, but we can have both Emma and Christine, who are left on this call, to respond.
I think that would ideally mean, and how that would happen is partnerships and mergers. And currently, what is going on in Kenya is that these leaders, by the institutions of power that they represent, and they've been pedestalized to, they're so out of touch. And this partnership that Kenyan women, the regular, local, let me just say, working Kenyan woman is expecting, goes beyond hashtags. It goes beyond drafting a solidarity statement. So it is actually going to the grassroots to work with these women and even providing the enough empowerment where the dependability on donor aid, on debt and austerity measures that have different repercussions that eventually affect our economies, that we are independent of that. So I was sorry to veer off topic a little, but I feel it's kind of related in regards to holding holders of office responsible to working with the issues of interest that we're highlighting. For example, in this webinar on fascism and imperialism, we were talking about femicide, and one of those things we addressed and highlighted and all agreed on was that there's no presence of our women leaders. And when we want to invite them over, we would not just want something for photo ops or dialogue and just maybe draft statements. We actually want to be recognized. We want to be empowered. We want to be listened to. We want more than a seat at the table. So the partnership that we are also interested in as working women of this country is to go somewhere beyond meeting these people or even just having proximity, but actually having them address our issues. Right now, there is inflation. Right now, there is unrest. There is violence, a violent police in Kenya. There is protests, and people are being arrested. People are being abducted. So what we're looking forward to for partnerships is actually our women leaders, and I'm contextualizing this particularly in Kenya because the way I see it and with the current state of affairs, what we would want is just more than textbook partnership. What we would want is actually being involved, them being very much privy to our struggles, the struggles of the Kenyan women, and particularly as we also just address fascism and also NATO imperialism, as well as other issues that are also related to it, because fascism is related to imperialism, which are also related to GBV and also femicide cases. So that would be my contribution on that question. Back to you, Donna.
Thanks, Christine. Emma, do you have a response?
Yes, especially in the question of how do we work together between grassroots and parliamentarians in terms of speaking out against war and preventing war. International alliances like International Women's Alliance, where has gathered us here today, are really wonderful for genuine political organizing and coordination. So I think that really engaging in our alliances and these educational discussions, as we're doing right now, to get sort of on the same page, are really helpful and can be a launch pad for political coordination in the future. So the root cause of war and like the buildup of war against China that affects environments and lands and people and women all around the world is this crisis of capitalism and imperialism. So understanding that as the root cause is daunting because it takes a long time and really a lot of unity building over a long period, of course, to unite the broad masses to wage movements to really create a socialist alternative. But in the meantime, I think taking up campaigns, coordinating on campaign work through the alliances can help us do things like or cut military aid, and in this long-term goal of stopping the root causes of war through weakening the crisis of like U.S. hold over the world.
That was great. Thank you very much for those answers and questions. So I think really we've come to the end. I think we found so many questions actually answered in these presentations. So I want to thank everyone for taking part. And also, we've just put on the screen the calls to action, which are the NATO summit in Ankara in Turkey. That's in July 7th to 8th. If you can get there, please do, but at least get in touch with us to find out more. The Festival of Resistance and Protest Action in Brussels, Belgium, and the Week of Action for Peace and Climate Justice, September the 21st to the 27th, which is also very important because unless we can stop these horrendous, these destructive, these polluting wars, we're not going to get anything changed in the climate. So I'll hand over to Donna now to finish off our video and our webinar and to say our goodbyes.
Yes, thank you, Pippa, and thank you to our guests and esteemed panelists. Also to those who couldn't be with us today for taking the time out of their busy schedules to submit video messages of solidarity. And to all of you for joining us today to learn about the issues that the people in the international community are facing in today's very volatile crisis. The current political crisis of war and militarism is really driven by the crisis of the economy. And that is the issue of capitalism being a dying and moribund system that is not sustainable for majority of the people of the world. And we've heard from our speakers some of the common threads of the most impacted are those that are on the margins, right? The most exploited and oppressed people are the working people, the rural people, women and children. And those who are responsible are those who uphold the principles of big power and money, the imperialists, the capitalists, the fascists. And so, as many of our speakers have shared, the solution to that is to get educated, right? Hold more educational activities such as this, create opportunities for political cooperation and coordination, to wage campaigns and to call for solidarity in action and not just in name. And so we thank you all again for joining us today. Let's continue to forge ahead, continue the fight to abolish NATO, to end all wars of aggression, and to uphold the rights of all people, all women, for all of humanity, and to also continue to protect our lands, our communities, and Mother Earth. So until next time, please do visit our websites for Global Women United for Peace Against NATO and also International Women's Alliance. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts. And so we'll see you out there continuing on the fight. Long live international solidarity.